would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Thomas Onwell, the geopolitical and energy expert in Berlin and the global fellow at Wilson. Welcome, Dr. Onwell. How are you? Of the report of the IEA came with many different details. We can see this decline in the development, increasing in the demand in the Asia. Do you think we are going to witness a very confusing and concerning situation in the coming winter?
Well, first off, Ahmed, thank you very much for having me on your network tonight, being able to speak to people in Egypt. Well, as you said, it is complicated, and I have to say, if it was just talking about the market, it's the usual supply and demand complications. I can talk about that. And on the other hand, the big variable is geopolitics, of course. There could be a huge swing that has nothing to do with the ability to supply or the demand for gas. So depending on what you would like, let me take supply and demand first. The IEA, correctly points out that it seems to me that demand is growing in Asia somewhat. Of course, China is doing it very badly, but relative to what things were, it is growing, and slightly in Europe, but also again, Europe is depressed in their industrial output, especially Germany, but it is growing. And so on the one hand, you have this growth in demand. The United States is doing very well, but of course they're loaded with gas they have themselves at a low price. That's separate. On the other hand, the supply, now Europe, of course, swore off Russian gas. The Russians actually cut off the gas in the Nord Stream pipelines as a preparation for the war in Ukraine to pressure countries in Europe to not support Ukraine. That didn't work, but they cut off a huge amount of gas, causing a terrible crisis, as you and your listeners know. Now, there is still some Russian gas going across Ukraine to Europe, but that will end at the end of this year. That contract is a 5-year contract. It'll end at the end of this year. That concerns primarily Austria, Slovakia, and also Hungary, of course. And we could talk about how each country could really deal with that. But it would cause some difficulties. Now, there are a number of very large projects coming online in the United States and in Qatar especially. Both of those countries are going to roughly double their output over the next few years. But that's coming step by step. And the IEA, looking at this, said, just looking at the market alone, there could be some tightness in winter with the things I've currently mentioned. I haven't mentioned about the Straits of Hormuz yet. That's another issue.
Dr. O'Donnell, in general, the European consumption has reduced regarding the gas by 20% in the first half of this year because maybe it has stored a lot or consumed less. You think this percentage is assuring for Europe in order to pass away this winter safely?
Well, I would say let's discuss this. Yes, I would say this has to be discussed on two different levels. Of course, if you talk to the officials in Brussels, they'll give a very optimistic point of view, and they'll say things that are true. The European Union, contrary to what Putin and the Russians expected, by cutting off this huge pipeline through Nord Stream 2 that went to Germany and to Europe, and by cutting off various other things, refusing to fill reserves of oil during the winter before the war began, they expected a huge crisis, and they got a huge crisis. It was a huge crisis in Europe. But what was unexpected to the Russians is that instead of primarily fighting each other, the Europeans united and conserved gas, went through all sorts of measures to conserve gas, and the United States and Qatar both, especially the United States, organized the delivery of LNG to Europe. China did not need as much LNG that year because of corona problems. And so much of the gas that the Qataris and others would send to Asia came to Europe. So they got through the crisis, and little by little, they're getting more LNG. And they have 95% of their storage full for winter. So on that point of view, it looks like, wow, they did pretty good compared to what Mr. Putin intended to do to them. On the other hand, you could say that was a victory, but I have been saying, in a way, it's a Pyrrhic victory, especially for the Germans, but for Europe in general. because they have replaced the cheap Russian gas, pipeline gas, with LNG, which is, of course, more expensive. And that means that European industry, such as German heavy industry, chemical industry, metals industry, what should I say, automobile industry, are all doing very badly because they already were not very competitive for various high-cost issues in Europe. But with the higher cost of energy now, they're in serious trouble. So yes, Europe had a certain victory against what Putin intended to do, but on the other hand, it's a sort of Pyrrhic victory that they're not competitive, and there's a lot of talk of deindustrialization. So any further disruption to the supply of natural gas this winter could be devastating to Europe. And now the biggest disruption would be, of course, geopolitically.
Maybe the prices now are high globally, and with the decline in the production in Africa and United States, that maybe it's only temporary and the prices are going to low again.
Yeah.
Also, the European concern is from the Russian supplies that may be stopped because the bad relation between Europe and Moscow. But even the numbers by the IEA, the Russian supplies has increased for Europe by 5% in the first quarter of this year. So Europe is not very afraid that the Russian supplies are going to stop.
Well, I think it's almost certain that the gas that goes across Ukraine up to, I don't know, it varies the amount, but let's say 10 billion cubic meters a year. It varies up and down. That's going to end. The Ukrainians have no interest in negotiating with the Russians to renew that contract. So the European Union is actually scrambling. They're talking to the Azerbaijanis, hoping that the Azerbaijanis can send some gas through Russia, actually, and then into Ukraine in an old gas pipeline system, more southerly through Ukraine, and then into some of these Eastern European countries to replace it partially. But on the other hand, also LNG, Russian LNG is still coming into Europe. That has not been sanctioned. It's not a huge percentage, but it's significant because supply and demand is so tight in Europe, and the price problem is so tight. Now, the Europeans have put new sanctions, their 14th package of sanctions just a couple months ago, where they say no longer can Russian LNG come into Europe and be resold. And also, the Indians, quite surprisingly perhaps, have said they're not going to take Russian LNG from the new LNG2 project in the Arctic. So, yes, some Russian LNG is still coming into Europe. The gas pipeline will be cut off. There might be some from Azerbaijan, but I think the IEA is correct. When you look at the balance of things, unless the economy really goes badly in Europe, if it keeps somewhat increasing, even though it's below what it was historically, they need more LNG. And Asia is growing and needs more LNG. Not China, but other places need it. So it's going to be tight, and the prices are going to be high. And the big elephant in the room, does Mr. Netanyahu really want to push for something like regime change in Iran? Does he want to really devastatingly bomb Iran's oil sector or nuclear or whatever to such an extent? He goes over a certain line where the regime in Tehran thinks they are really threatened, their existence, their future is threatened. They can easily shut down not only the oil-producing facilities around the Gulf with missiles for some period of time, the total export of LNG from Qatar has to go through the Straits of Hormuz. And I don't want to go on too long, but if the Houthis cannot be stopped.
There is something important. Maybe Europe now is afraid from Netanyahu is going to hit Iran's oil facilities, and at the same time they are not afraid of Putin, who is considered an enemy, and they're giving at least enough supplies for Europe. It's something different. Do you think that it's a geopolitical tension plays all different roles that maybe not clearly understood right now?
Well, Ahmed, that's a very good point. And let me say this. I think overwhelmingly most of Europe would like to just cut off the Russian gas and look elsewhere, do anything they could to make life difficult for Putin in attacking, in making war in Ukraine. However, there are a couple regimes, or governments, I should say, member states in Europe, especially Mr. Orban in Hungary, who don't agree. He wants to use the crisis to get a good deal on gas from Putin, play both sides one against the other. He acts very pro-Putin. And the problem is you need unanimity in the votes of the European Union to take measures on Ukraine. And so they've made this deal with Orban. Orban will either sit back or allow the vote to take place to proceed with the measures the European Union takes against Ukraine, weapons, money, refusing gas, as long as he can buy Russian gas. So it's a compromise they had to make. They're doing a lot to hurt Russia and to stand up with Ukraine, but if they didn't give Mr. Orban something, he'd put a monkey wrench, he'd overthrow everything. So yes, it's not so much hypocrisy, I think. I think this is a matter of pragmatic politics.
Mr. O'Donnell, we cannot see a huge pressure from Europe to stop any potential attacks on Iran, and to avoid this major crisis that will be affecting Europe, especially that we are in winter. Why Europe is not having specific pressures against Israel to stop any potential attacks on the oil facilities in Iran that would make a major crisis?
I could answer that on two different levels. On the one level, there are some governments who'd want to speak out very strongly against that, but there's other governments who aren't. And we know the European Union has this problem. They need unanimity in order for, it's currently Mr. Borrell, but he's being replaced with a new foreign minister. To speak strongly, they need unanimity, and there's different points of view. Now, I think a good example is the United States. On the one hand, the United States, the Biden administration, obviously supports that that the Israelis, that Mr. Netanyahu carries out his war against Gaza and carries out his war against Lebanon. They don't like the way he carries out the war in Gaza. They don't like the fact that he doesn't have some plan for the end of it, but they're not going to actually stop him. And the same thing, they're upset that what's the plan for Lebanon in the end, that Netanyahu doesn't have a plan except smash Hezbollah, smash Hamas. And I would say, okay, wait 10 years and do it again. That's not a plan. And it looks like his attitude towards Iran is similar. And so I think what the Americans are doing is saying, okay, they understand he wants to do these things against this axis, as they say, a Tehran axis, but don't go so far that the leadership in Tehran, that the mullahs feel they're really coming for us. They really want to make our future impossible. And when the leadership in Tehran has nothing to lose, they could retaliate in a way that could close the oil and gas system for who knows how long. And that would be a big world crisis. The United States should be directly involved. So on the one hand, they want to allow Israel to fight against these its enemies as it sees it, right? But not to go so far as to provoke a regional war. That's a fine line, and it's getting harder to walk. So it's a very dangerous situation. I agree with you.
Our guest from Berlin, Dr. Thomas Ornell, the expert in geopolitical, and he said the title correctly. Thank you so much for being with us. He said the title correctly, but I just didn't catch it.
It's okay. Thank you very much.